Hi, and welcome back to Cloud Native Go. My name's Leander Reimer, and I'm happy to be your host. So this fourth section of this course is all about Kubernetes and how you can use it to orchestrate our Go microservice. So in this section, we're going to take a look at a brief overview of the Kubernetes architecture and the main concepts. We then are going to deploy our Go microservice to Kubernetes locally using Minikube. I'm going to show you how you implement high-level concepts such as the deployment and the service descriptors you need to run a microservice in Kubernetes. And finally, I'm going to show you how you can scale deployments and perform rolling updates on those deployments. So as usual, a lot of ground to cover. So let's get started. Now in this very first video, I want to give you a brief overview of Kubernetes, its architecture, and its main concepts. So in this video, we're going to take a look at the basic architecture of a Kubernetes cluster. I'm going to talk about the key concepts, the main building blocks you need to be aware of. I briefly cover how you can set up a Kubernetes cluster in the cloud or set it up locally. And last but not least, I'm going to give you a brief introduction to the Kubernetes command line interface utility, which we will be using throughout this session and this section pretty much. Alright, so what's this Kubernetes all about? Well, Kubernetes is one of several cluster operating systems you can choose from at the moment, right? And it's definitely the most popular. Maybe you've heard of DCOS, maybe you've heard of Rancher, maybe you've heard of OpenShift if you're in a commercial environment, which is basically a commercialized multi-tenant version of Kubernetes. Maybe you have heard of Giant Swarm, which is a managed Kubernetes service in the cloud, or Nomad or Docker Data Center. But Kubernetes is definitely the technology where the most attention is at the moment. So this is the basic architecture of a Kubernetes cluster. And it consists of two distinct, node types. On the left-hand side, you see the Kubernetes master. Okay? You may have one master, you may have several masters for higher availability setups. And you as an administrator, you mainly interact with the master via a REST API or later on via the Kubernetes CLI. So this master, it offers an API server, it offers a controller manager, the scheduler, which is responsible for scheduling tasks and containers to the minions, and it also contains an etcd key value store, which basically is the brain of the whole Kubernetes cluster. So this etcd holds the whole state of this cluster. On the right-hand side, you have the so-called minions, sometimes called worker nodes. Okay, so as a user, when you access certain services that run on the Kubernetes cluster, you usually interact with those minions. Now, in the minion, you have a kube proxy, which is responsible for taking inbound traffic and directing it to the containers running within it. You have a kubelet, which is responsible for managing the container engine and for managing the ports and containers that run within this container engine. And it's the master node that talks to, the minions via the kubelet. So at the heart of the minion, you have a container engine. Well, usually there's the container engine Docker, but you could also use Rocket as a container engine. And the container engine is then responsible for running the pods and the containers. So here are some key concepts and building blocks you should definitely know when working with Kubernetes. Okay? Well, we talked about the pods in the previous slides. So let's start with them. So pods are the smallest deployable compute unit in Kubernetes. Okay? So think of pods as a grouping of, Docker containers maybe, right? So a pod can contain one or many Docker containers. Now the important thing to know is that if you have multiple containers in a pod, okay, they share a same fate, okay? So if one of the containers dies or exits, the whole pod will exit and all of the contained containers. So if you think about, well, how you can divide up your application containers into pods, well, you have to make the choice if you stick one container in one pod or maybe multiple containers in one pod, which does make sense under certain circumstances, okay? Now, those pods, they can be given labels, okay? So labels are basically arbitrary key value pairs used to identify objects within Kubernetes. So later on, you can then say, show me all the pods with label backend tier, or show me all the pods that are in the test environment, and so on and so forth. So use labels to identify things within Kubernetes. At the very top, you see a service, and the service is an important concept in Kubernetes. Well, pods are dynamic, okay? Pods have a unique IP address. Pods come and go. So, as a client for those services or those containers within the pods, you never know which one to talk to. And this is what the service is for. It's an abstraction for a logical grouping of pods. Okay, so the service has a unique IP address and it has a DNS name which you can use to talk to the pods behind the service. And it's the service responsibility to proxy any inbound calls to the running pods behind it. But as a client, you're not aware of the number of pods behind the service, okay? It can be one, it could be many. Now, the replica sets ensure that always the required number of pod replicas are running within your Kubernetes cluster, okay? So if you say, I always want 3 instances of this pod running, it's the replica set that takes care of, managing this. So if one pod dies, the replica set will spin up another one, so you're up to the desired amount of replicas again. Or if you tell the replica set, hey, I need 2 more, then it's the replica set that will spin up the 2 more instances. Now, last but not least, it's the deployment you use to declare pods and replica controllers and labels and volumes all in one go. So the deployment is a major concept, a major building block which we'll be using throughout this section, throughout these videos. Now, just briefly, how can you set up Kubernetes in the cloud or locally? Well, technically, you can run Kubernetes almost anywhere, right? So if you download the Kubernetes distribution, there's a shell script provided, and what you can do is you can specify a few additional environment variables, like you see here, for example, to have GCE, so that's the Google Compute Engine as a Kubernetes provider, or maybe AWS as an infrastructure as a service provider to host your Kubernetes cluster. So just export a few environment variables and then issue the curl request you see here. And after maybe 30 minutes, you have a running Kubernetes cluster in the cloud. Now, obviously, throughout this course, we want to have, short development round trips. So what we use is we use something called Minikube instead, okay? So Minikube lets you run a very small Kubernetes cluster locally on your machine. So this is what we will be using throughout this section and throughout those following videos. Now, the main tool we use to interact with our Kubernetes cluster is the Kubernetes command line interface. And I'm going to show you this live. So let's open our console. I issue Minikube status. And we should see the stat of our Minikube server shortly. So the Minikube VM is running and the local kube is running as well. So kube control is the command line interface we use to interact with our Kubernetes cluster. So you see here, there are a lot of commands available. And maybe the most basic command is kubectl cluster info. So this tells us some basic information about our Kubernetes cluster. So this is the Kubernetes master running here on a local IP address, the kubedns service, and the Kubernetes dashboard. So let's have a look at the dashboard. So do minikube dashboard. And now our browser should open up in our default browser. And you see here, hopefully in a few seconds, that the dashboard is coming up. Okay? So if you don't like interacting with Kubernetes on the command line, you can always use this dashboard instead. Okay? So what you can, for example, do is kubectl get nodes, display the number of nodes. And basically we only expect one node here because we're running locally. Just to show you, you can say kubectl config. I see here those are the available contexts. I have minikube currently. Now here I switch to this context, and what I do now is I use kubectl and get nodes, and you see here I see 3 nodes. This is a Kubernetes cluster instance running in the cloud. Okay, so this was a very basic introduction to Kubernetes and its key building blocks.